wanted to try and talk about the solar business in a way that since this is public policy, that talks about the public policy of the federal government affecting the public policy in New Jersey, which then affected the idea of an economic stimulus package in New Jersey. And that's going to be the theme of solar energy in New Jersey that we're going to talk about, since New Jersey is the second largest solar economy in the country, and it's not because of the sun. I'm going to then talk about how an entrepreneur like myself would see that opportunity and what I decided to do about it, how a business became a real company. We now have over $1 billion to commit and install in New Jersey in the solar marketplace, the projects that we will own and operate. So I'll show you how that business got put together in a very short time. It's been less than a year, maybe a year and a half that the regulations have been in place properly. And then what does that do for the state of New Jersey, the program that we are now installing, the projects that we're putting in, coming back to how we accomplish the public policy. Why is Governor Christie and President Solomon, the head of the BPU, very much in favor of KDC Solar and what we're doing? Because we're right behind the public policy that they're trying to put forward. So that's the envelope that I want to give you. Touch a little bit about business, a little bit about policy, and about the results of how good policy, structured right, run right, can actually get the accomplishment of what they're trying to do, and how that kind of rolls into the energy picture. Solar's never going to be oil from the standpoint of where it's at, but if we could go from 1% solar to 2% solar, it's a big move for the country. All right, wait, just sit down here. All right, so what happened at the federal level first with policy? Federal government said every state must have 20% renewable energy sources by the years 2021. A lot of you know about the 18-year-old drinking age. Okay, it was not passed by a law that was voted on. It was buried inside the transportation funding that a state received. If you don't have 18-year-old age for drinking, it's okay. You just won't get any federal funds for your highways. A big problem. They did the same thing here. Renewable energy standards are not a law that got passed. It's a request that you then don't get your money that you want from the federal government for many programs. Okay, so that's the way the federal government will enforce their policies. So if you want their money, live by their rules. That means you better get the 20% by the year 2021. Okay, so what did New Jersey do? They created, they took the mandate and said, well, that means we need 2,000 megawatts of solar. And each of the components, I won't go down into the details, but in order to get to that number, there's a wind component, there's a biomass and landfill, and there's solar. If you think about New Jersey, the most populated state in the country, not a lot of land, so we aren't going to see the massive Arizona, New Mexico solar projects. You're not going to see massive wind projects, so they're trying to put them out in the Atlantic. There's not a lot more biogas that you can take out of landfills, and there's not a lot of wood that we can go burn. So the real way that New Jersey is going to accomplish this number is by solar energy. We have a lot of rooftops, a lot of parking, carports, and a lot of businesses that have land that they can't utilize because they were limited to how big a footprint they could put a building. So in order to get to 2,000 megawatts by 2021 and 4,500 megawatts by 2026, that is a massive accomplishment. I said we're second to California right now in the country. We're seventh in the world, in the largest solar economy in the world. How many megawatts do we have? We just passed 300 megawatts. And we're second and seventh in the world. And we want to go from 300 to 2,000. Besides the fact that that's going to require $12 billion of investment. It's a massive undertaking. So you better get all the things right to attract $12 billion of investment into the state, or none of this is going to happen. So they came up with the reasons that people come to New Jersey. Why is New Jersey the most exciting place? Why was the chairman of a major Chinese solar company in my office last week offering us $750 million worth of funding to buy his panels? Because we are the best place right now in the world to put solar. All comes from policies and public policies. Okay. All right. So one of the things the state did is they said, all right, well, if we're going to get there, we better figure out how we're going to get there, and we better start to mandate certain amounts of megawatts. It really comes back to gigawatt hours a year, and I won't bother you with how that actually happens. We'll just keep it simple for now for megawatts. Megawatts of a solar project. Obviously, solar only runs 1,500 hours a year when the sun is out, so you don't make the same megawatts as a 1 megawatt cogen. You make 1.5 million kilowatts instead of 5 or 7 million kilowatts from a megawatt of the power plant. But putting that aside, this is the curve that the state of New Jersey has required that the industry meet. Okay, and now you say, well, that's great, they've got this requirement. How are they going to make this happen? Who are they making come to the state? Okay, so New Jersey got out ahead of the curve. This is back in around 2006 or 7. They started an idea that was called net metering. And what they said there is, okay, if we're going to put solar on rooftops and carports and on the ground, we want to have it distributed out to the locations, so we're going to force the utility company to interconnect at the meter. Let's take a house for a simple example. You put 100 kilowatts on your roof. If the utility wasn't required to allow you to interconnect to their meter, that would sit there and do nothing. You'd have to be what's called off the grid. You'd have to have your own system. So first off, the BPU said, no, you've got to interconnect to the utility meter. And if we're really going to make a dent in solar, we're going to have a system put up there that if your house uses 1 million kilowatt hours in a year, I want to put a solar system up that makes you net zero. Net zero means I'm going to make 1 million kilowatt hours in the course of the year from the system. Okay, that's the greenest you can be. If you're a lead, you're going to get the most points for being a net zero. I'm going to match the kilowatts I produce with the kilowatts that you use. The problem is you use kilowatts on cloudy days, on night times, and so on. So I have to force the utility to act as a bank. I'm going to put a system up that's going to make 1 million kilowatts in the 1,500 hours of the sun, mainly from April to October. And the meter then has to be changed to be able to run backwards. So that the utility is going to get those extra kilowatts, run everything backwards on your meter, all your transmission, distribution, all those charges, and then you're going to pull it back when you need it. And if at the end of a year, we balance 1 million use and 1 million was generated by the solar, your bill is zero. Okay? That's a simple way of explaining net metering. Okay? And by net metering, you now have the ability to put in systems that can make a difference in solar, not ones that are just ancillary, but now I can take and put up a very large system that's going to meet an industrial load. I can put a 10 megawatt solar system up for New York Life and Cokesbury for their data center and make all their kilowatts for the year and make them a net zero data center, as an example. So net metering was critical. New Jersey pioneered this, went through a bunch of BPU regulations, a lot of NOPRs and public hearings with the utility companies objecting and then getting it and then going back and forth, and ultimately got it right. So the first thing is a check mark next to New Jersey for getting net metering. It is now, I don't know, it's in 38 or 42 of the states. Every state now is just taking New Jersey's net metering program and adopting it. Great, because that's the only way solar is going to get put out through our country, is in this way. Okay, so that was setting, if you will, the infrastructure of the how. Now let's get into the why. Why would a utility company, why would someone allow solar to happen? Utility companies, let's take a few steps back. In the deregulation that went on when I was in the independent power business, one of the outcomes of that was that generation was split off from transmission and distribution. So the present utility companies, and I know there's exceptions, I won't go through that, but the basics are the present utility companies transmit and distribute your power. They're responsible for all the wires, substations, transformers, and so on. Other companies generate the kilowatts. Utility company has to buy them if they're sending them to you, but companies can also buy directly and have them just transmitted to them. That's called the ISO, the Independent System Operator model. Okay, so that model allowed utilities not to care, if you will, in quotes, not to care about the generation side of the business. They're not making any money. Their shareholders don't make money from generating kilowatts. They make them from transmitting and distributing kilowatts. Okay, so how can we get the utility companies to cooperate? If they don't cooperate, none of this is happening. well, you can't say just be a good neighbor and they work in Allstate. It's not going to work here, right? Utility companies just by its nature don't like independent power guys. They just, I'll show you my old businesses in a moment, and it's just not a pleasant situation. So they came up with a concept in New Jersey again. This was back in 2007. They came up with an idea. It's called the Solar Alternative Compliance Payment, the SCAP. And the SCAP is a price that matches the megawatts required in reverse. So the SCAPs for 2011, the year we're in now, are actually $700. And I'll come back to what that means in a moment. Okay. So an SCAP is a mechanism to charge the utility company's shareholders a fine if the utility company can't deliver to the Board of Public Utilities enough certificates to show that there were that many solar megawatts produced. Okay, so what is a solar certificate? Let's do some definitions. A solar renewable energy certificate, an SRAC, is 1,000 kilowatts. For every 1,000 kilowatts produced in New Jersey, you earn one SRAC. And those SRACs now are bought by anyone that generates power or the utility companies at any price at or below the SCAP. So if the SCAP's at $700, you trade your SRACs at $680 if it's in demand. Okay? And by doing that, utility got away from, the BPU got away from having a direct liability on the shareholders of the utility company, since it's an auction. Okay? It's a bid, it's an auction. So if I generate 1,000 kilowatts and I get one SRAC today, I can go into any one of many markets on the internet or direct and sell it for $675, $680. You put a bid out there and somebody strikes it, and then it changes certificates. Every certificate's numbered. Okay, and the BPU orchestrates all this. They approve a system that's online, that's net metered, that then has, okay, you've now earned your 15 years of SRACs. The day you turn on, you earn 15 years of SRACs. No force majeure. Okay, and earning those SRACs, you now have the ability to sell those, and that's where the financing for these projects come from. Okay. So, this is the key concept. So let me try and go through this a little bit, ask questions. But if you have an SCAP number at 700 and that number drops down for the next 15 years, okay, give you some sense, Pennsylvania is not a solar state because they're trying to get people at $250 or $300 SRACs. It's not enough money for me to pay for the building of the system and the operating of the system. Okay. As prices come down, particularly in China, as prices come down over years, you can afford to let the SCAPs go down because you can buy things cheaper or you're amortizing your project. Okay, so the SCAP is a way to drive this market. It's an economic stimulus package because at $700, that's the equivalent of 70 cents a kilo subsidy that I'm receiving from the utility companies. Okay? So there's many ways to help promote this, but that's the way that New Jersey chose to do. Now, in order to get the utility to behave right, it was great to have a fine to the shareholders. You got their attention. For every SRAC that they buy, it gets put in the rate base. So if they buy an SRAC at anything at or less than the SCAP, it's in the rate base, which means they don't care. Okay? If it's an SCAP that they had to pay a fine on, and last year the utilities were short SRACs, there weren't enough produced, so they paid a $40 million fine to the BPU, to the state of New Jersey. So it meant that by putting this system together, utilities are promoting people like me to be successful because of the interest of their own shareholders not paying a fine. Now they may pass that back to other generators and their shareholders, but ultimately the concept of shareholder versus rate base is what New Jersey figured out and got right. All right, so that's a really key difference in the policy. In the beginning, in 2007, when New Jersey put this together, they said, you know what, this is a great program, and we'll buy the SRACs, the state of New Jersey. It took all of 12 months for them to realize, oh my God, we can't afford to do that. And they stopped the program. And the program took a year off. A lot of companies went out of business, and in 2009, it came back. I started looking at the industry in 2007. I'll show you later, put a team together in 2008. 2009, we got serious. The beginning of 2010, January of 2010, the two governors, as they were changing, signed the law that allowed any size project to happen, and some other things with the SRACs that allowed someone like me to come in as a real industrial guy and do large projects. They had a 2-megawatt cap arbitrarily put on before, but I'll come back to that.
I'm a little confused on the time. How does it meet that? Is there a time limit on the certificate?
Yes, well.
Because you're going to meet each year.
Yes. Okay, so right now we're at 300 megawatts. We just passed 300 megawatts, right? And the need here was 255 megawatts for the entire year operating from June 1 to May 31. Okay, so this year we're probably still going to be slightly short of the kilowatt hours needed to meet that number. Next year, they're probably going to be right on, and in years 13 and 14, they're going to be too many kilowatts, too many SRACs. The prices are going to drop.
So they expire in a year?
No, you actually, an SRAC you can hold for 2 years plus the year you generated it. Okay, so you can put it in the market when you want, but the problem is if this year it's 700, the S cap, next year it's 675, then it's 650, then it's, and it goes down each year. So when you're holding it, you've got a lot of issues to look at. What's the market supply going to be next year? What's the price going to be? Can I forward sell this to people? It's a real commodity trading business, and we have a guy from Wall Street, our executive vice president, who that's what he focuses on, exactly that. We're going to have 250,000 SRACs. We're going to have maybe as much as 20% of the market. And so if there is an oversupply, we're going to hold our market power, and let's say there's expect to be 100,000 too many SRACs. We're going to say, we're not selling any of ours unless you pay us all at this price. Or we'll pull the whole 250 out and you'll pay a fine based on 150,000. So that shareholder fine versus rate base is really, really critical, and it works. People getting it or?
Sure. I have a question. This may be kind of silly, but like, how do you attract shareholders or like investors when there's such a large downside? Like, there's a risk of having a fund. What's the point? Why would I invest in these things if I could sign at the end of the year?
Yeah, I'll go into the investment. I'm not going to necessarily do a model with you, but I'll talk about why investors would come in. And a lot has to do with the experience that we had in New York. And we're by far the largest capitalized, what they call PPA solar guy in the state. There's a couple of us that have capital, but hundreds of millions where we're at the billion and a half. So we've taken a different tact. If you're the big guy on the street. When I was doing power plants, GE used to say if you have 100 megawatts, the utility company owns you. If you have 600 megawatts, you own the utility company. Because if you shut down, you give them a big problem. You can't brand out New York. Well, I don't have to run. You have to buy. And so there's a lot of market power you get by being big in the market, even though it's a very small market and minute compared to the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of things that happen here. So the whole concept of S-caps and SRACs was a policy that New Jersey put in place after a one-time turn that didn't work because the buyer was not deep enough, and New Jersey's treasury wasn't deep enough to make this happen, to where they then went back to the policy room and figured out how to come back out, working with people. That year that they were redoing the policy, I'm sure there were others, but people like us were in there with the BPU and their staff working with them on how to make this work. Would we bring capital and would we bring a company to the table if? What were the conditions that would attract us to put a business together in New Jersey?
So they were very proactive in working with entrepreneurs to figure that out. Very different than the past. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
There are just so few success stories in policy. It's not just
Exactly.
getting it right.
Oh, and you know, we tell this to the world. I mean, we tell the world that New Jersey got something right, and they did it. They have a history which is interesting too, unlike New York State, that I'll show my power plants later, that changed the rules when Governor Pataki wanted a rate reduction and forced this whole reorganization of the state, avoided contracts, all that. New Jersey has never done that. They've always honored contracts and changed the law and then grandfathered people previous to that. And that was very important too. The history of New Jersey in acting the way they acted was just as important as the laws they were putting in place.
The credibility.
If their credibility had been New York State, why is there no solar in New York State? Not because they don't have opportunities, because no one believes them. They're called a socialistic government, and they change every time the new politicians come in, and they don't respect the past. And they've done that on telecom, they've done that in power. So why would someone come and make a big investment any more than you would in a geopolitical, unstable country where you mentioned before they can just take the asset from you? Well, New York hasn't acted too differently. Okay, we used to call it regulatory extortion. And that has now come back to bite them, you know, in my opinion. Where New Jersey has always respected the contract, respected the investment and the jobs, and said, fine, I'll change the law going forward. Okay? Very important. So from a policy point of view, they interacted with businessmen, they respected, they had a good credibility, and they found a way to work it right. Okay. So everyone kind of has a good sense of why this works now and why this is there? Okay. So let's take a bookmark and take a break, let your brains absorb that, and kind of take now a different tangent of how did I get here, why am I here, and then how does all this come together? Okay, so yeah, I went to work at Exxon out of college here for a year, and then went to my father's business and yada yada, boiler rooms and so on. And in 83, I left and formed my own business, and he came to work for me for 10 years. And because I saw the independent power business, I was in a construction business, I wanted to own assets. I wanted to own infrastructure because I didn't want to keep feeding the construction beast. So I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know how I wanted it. And the power business was opened up. And again, it was looking at policy. 1979, FERC passes something called PURPA, Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. And in that law was passed the requirement of utilities to buy independent power kilowatts. But it wasn't until 1982, when the Alcan case went to the Supreme Court, that the how they had to buy was set up. So they had to do it, but they fought like crazy. And then it was set up as to how they had to do it. Combine that with New York State, who said, hey, I want to develop an economic stimulus package off of this PURPA law to keep jobs in New York State. And so what they did is they passed the 6-cent law and these tracking style contracts that paid us 6, 8, 10, 11, 17 cents a kilowatt if we put a cogeneration facility, gas-fired in our case, at a paper mill, a chemical plant, and fed them steam. Most of the time they were getting free steam. And in doing so, we kept 500 jobs in a paper mill running that would have otherwise closed. And it was very successful. Okay? But and we became the largest privately held independent power company. We had 600 megawatts, and I had $800 million worth of plants that we built, owned, and operated. We did it with a fairly small amount of people, but it was at pulp and paper mills for the most part. First project was here in New Jersey. Oh, that's not turned out too well. Was out in Milford, New Jersey, but the rest of them were in New York State. So this is, anyone from Syracuse? Syracuse Fairgrounds. This is the project right behind the fairgrounds, and this project was feeding the water that kept the sidewalks unmelted and the heating of the big buildings and so on. And it was built on a Superfund site, the Allied Superfund site. This is these are both 100 megawatt facilities. This was a 100 megawatt facility at Beaver Falls, and this was a 60 megawatt facility at Governor. These are both paper mills. This was another paper mill, one at Carthage and one at South Glens Falls, and they were 50, 60 megawatts. This was the first LM6000. It's an aeroderivative turbine that hangs off your 767s, but it was put as a power plant, and this is a 15 megawatt greenhouse. All of these paper mills were in business only because they were now able to get free steam. So each of these small towns had the major employer or the only employer kept there because of an economic stimulus package and a program that was very smartly combined by the state of New York at the time. Had they let it go, those plants would still be there, and the power we were producing would still be economically beneficial to the state of New York. Governor Pataki comes in and wants to get reelected and demands a rate reduction from Niagara Mohawk, who is the utility company. Niagara Mohawk says, I have $11 billion worth of these projects under contract approved by FERC and you. How can I can't just eliminate those. Let me just give you one other sense before there were 300 entrepreneurs trying to be in the independent power business in New York in the early 80s. 19 of us survived and built big businesses. All of us were engineers. So a lot of the lawyers and investment bankers that didn't understand heat rates and didn't understand what they were really going to build and operate failed. There were 29 major projects that represented that $11 billion worth of contracts. So we had 6 of them. So fairly substantial amount. Plus, because of the leverage we had, they didn't like when we would decide not to run or whatever. They took us and made us capacity payments only, 35 years. It's the only way that Governor Pataki could get us to the table to do his renegotiation was to threaten bankruptcy of the utility company. In doing so, a long result, 2.5 years later, they ended up floating $4.5 billion of high yield, gave that to the developers, gave us 24% of their public company, and $7 billion of contracts to keep the hydros in business. Governor Pataki got his rate reduction 2.5 years later. The outcome of that, though, was the shutdown of all of these facilities. No more paper mills. They're all gone. Every one of these projects is now is there vacant, and there's no paper mill. There's no 500 jobs. So Governor Pataki changed the policy midway to get a very short-term re-election of a few percentage points difference in his electric bill to whatever. And in doing so, 500 jobs at each one of these, and it duplicated on every one of the other projects, are all gone. So public policy is pretty good. Once you set it in place, you really got to stay and keep quiet about it and let it run if it's doing its job. And that's why New York is going to have a very tough time attracting project financing money back in on anything that they would do. GE was my main lender, my main partner. I did a couple of projects with Siemens and Deutsche Bank. Okay, so that happened through 98 through 2000. They bought out my power plants and had some projects in Italy. I sold those to the employees. In 1995, through another set of instances, I got exposed to the telecom. Again, public policy, right? The 2 people who convinced me to go into telecom, one chairman of a bank and the vice chairman of AT&T, were saying, you understand deregulation of electricity and natural gas. It's coming in telecom. You understand how to go raise a lot of money and build a big infrastructure project and company. We want you to come in and help us protect the tier 3 markets where we won't be able to protect ourselves against the bell companies when the deregulation separated AT&T, the long distance, from the local. And so we want you to put switches in the small markets and help us protect ourselves from this coming public policy. So I formed KMC Telecom in 1995. President Clinton in 1996 opens up the Telecom Act. And what resulted was KMC Telecom. We raised $2.3 billion. We had 1,500 people and $600 million in sales. It was the largest privately held CLEC. Princeton University was my partner. We had $1 billion of financing of switches we bought from Lucent. They funded $650 million. The green dots are all class 5 switches with sonnet rings in tier 3 markets. We did 40 of those. And all these little squares were the dial-up business, probably before you guys remember, when you had to dial and listen to that stupid sound before you interconnected to the internet. We carried 1/3 of the nation's dial-up on those switches. GE was involved with us at the time and so on. And ultimately, with the collapse of the telecom, we restructured and then sold that company. I did maintain a company with Princeton and Citibank called Hypercube, which is in Dallas. Still a $100 million a year business that's in the telecom space, in the wireless space. But anyway, again, it was a public policy that drove this infrastructure business to happen. You guys and the internet explosion have been because of that 1996 law that allowed all of these people like myself to go and innovate and exist. And now, unfortunately, we're going back to a duopoly that is not going to be very healthy for the future, in my opinion, of that industry. But we're not here to talk about that industry. Okay, so I said 2007 I started examining the business. One of the first things I wanted to do is if I was going to go into the solar business, and it was GE that was actually wanting to be my first partner in this, and to a big tune, $750 million, which I said no thank you to, and they knew that was going to be the case. They're an expensive partner. Was I said I'm going to pull back the team from the power business, because that's really what I needed to have around me if we were going to do this business again. So I pulled back. Of this, there's 25 people now that work for KDC Solar. The 7 or 8 top managers all were with me in the power business. So it's familiarity, it's everyone knows their job, it's a whole 9 yards of what we've seen and experienced before. I think I got 4 or 5 Lafayette engineers in here, so hopefully they'll continue to be good. So I put the business together by starting with the people I knew and then the company. Okay. I mentioned the Niagara Mohawk deal and floating the $4.5 billion on the high yield that paid us, the developers. DLJ did that deal, and Mike Ranger worked for DLJ and represented Niagara Mohawk on the opposite side of the table for me, 15 years ago. Mike now has a company called Diamond Castle. It was a large private equity firm in the power business. There were 4 people in the private equity business that were main involved in power. All of them wanted to be my partner, which is why GE knew they would not be my partner, because it was much more appropriate to have a private equity group than it was to have a lender structure. So Diamond Castle came in as my partner in last June, put in $225 million as all equity, committed an additional $350 million of equity. So we have $550 million of equity to go do this business plan. What is our plan? Now let's talk about, okay, so now you've seen the policies, kind of understood some of that. You've seen, trust me, an entrepreneur see an opportunity like I've seen before. Okay, this is no different than I've seen before. And now put the team back together, get the money behind us, and now what are we going to do in the marketplace? Well, for you that know GE, they're a very good training ground for project financing, so I'm going to talk about our program and relate it to financing, because that's the end of the day. If you can't get the money, you don't have a good business plan, all right? So first of all, we're doing a PPA. We're doing like we did in the power business. We're going to own and operate the project. We're going to put it on your site, and there's going to be no capital from you at all. We're going to be the owner of it. That means I can sell the tax equity and depreciation at a later time and get some capital from that. We're going to ask you to give us a long-term lease. So I'm going to pay you $1 a square foot for every square foot that I put solar on, as an upfront 20-year prepaid lease. So if I take 1 million square feet, I'm going to give you $1 million. And that's prepaying my 20-year lease. Why do I do that? So that I have bankruptcy protection. So if you or your landlord go bankrupt, I have protection. I have what's called quiet enjoyment. I've met my side of the lease. So in a trustee or a bankruptcy, I'm going to be able to remain there. Remember I said the SRACs are 15 years from the day we turn on, no force majeure. So I can't have somebody saying, get off my land, move, shut down, because I'm losing SRACs. Okay, so I needed to know that I could be there for the full 20 years. So this is the legal way of getting there, while at the same time saying, here, thanks for letting me be on your land. But that's not why they do this project. What we do is we say, okay, I'm going to give you 6 cents delivered to your meter, fixed for 20 years. Now, if you look at someone's typical industrial bill today in New Jersey, it's 12 cents a kilowatt. They might have 2 or 3 cents for the demand, the spike, and the rest of it's for their energy, their kilowatt hours. Of that, 8 or 9 cents, or say 8 cents, is the energy. And 2 or 3 cents is a transmission and distribution. In net metering, since I'm delivering it to the meter, the transmission and distribution charges go away, and the energy component go away. So, I'm saving them, and today probably it's 12 cents on the energy and 15 overall. I was wrong on that. So 12 cents is what we usually compare ourselves to on the energy and transmission and distribution, and then 3 more cents for the capacity. So I'm giving the people a 50% reduction today, and I'm fixing their power costs for 20 years with no escalation. Now that's just not an arbitrary number either, because New Jersey said, very smartly, unlike California, I didn't finish all the rules that New Jersey got right. California has a solar economy. It requires that if you put a solar project at a company and that company shuts down or goes bankrupt, your project is shut down. So that means solar projects that are at the Cisco's and Intel's and Google's, but they aren't at Joe's Pizza because you can't take a 20-year risk on Joe's Pizza staying there. So you couldn't, and companies don't. Companies have to then put their credit on the line. So most of the projects in California are paid for by the company because people like me, it's kind of hard to go in and take a 20-year risk that you're going to still be here. Even if you are in business, you may not be in this facility. Okay, New Jersey said, oh, we can't do that. We got to make it so that we're indifferent to the credit of the customer, but make the building and business be the efficiency to keep people here, even if that person leaves. So what they said is, if I put a project at a site and my tenant goes away, I will then be receiving from the utility company, as the meter runs backwards, wholesale power, which is roughly 6 cents. It goes up over 20 years. So if I'm receiving 6 cents from the utility company or the host, I'm now indifferent to the host's credit. I'll put it anywhere that is allowed to be put, and that building will have 20 years of 6-cent power. So if that tenant leaves, the landlord's going to have a damn good chance of bringing another tenant in because he's given him 50% reduction on his power cost. Keeping jobs in New Jersey. It's all about jobs in New Jersey.
So, but you're saying in the meantime, you're now providing, if there's no tenant, you're basically just providing power back in.
The meter's running backwards, going out to the utility, and I'm getting paid from them. I'm getting wholesale power. So I get the same price whether there's a host there or the utilities there. And that was absolutely key in New Jersey. It was hugely different than California, and it makes New Jersey work because you don't have to deal with the credit of the host on our deal. Now, a lot of people try and get the host to pay 10, 11, 12 cents, and then you got to go through what if the host goes away. We took the approach that why argue with the banks about the tenant's credit? Let's just go to 6 cents, and then let's not argue about escalation in the future. If there's zero, I'm going to have no debt or bank ever arguing with me about my electric revenues. The only argument is going to be what happens to SRACs. How much supply and demand do you have over the SRAC pricing structure? How much can you drive it? And that's where I mentioned before. By size, I believe we can drive a pretty good price because otherwise they'll be paying a fine if we withheld all of our SRACs. This is our program, all right? And it's pretty simple. Right? We have enough engineers and enough expertise. And when project limit of 2 megawatts was taken off, and there's probably 1,000 people in New Jersey who are solar installers, integrators, financing, yada, yada, whatever, that marketplace gets down really quick when you go over 3 megawatts. When you've got to really build a 5, 10, or 15, or 20 megawatt substation and interconnect and transmission lines and switchgear, the solar guys, the roofing guys, they have no clue what you're talking about and how to do that. So again, our expertise brought to this was hugely appropriate. No other developer from the New York State time is based in New Jersey or is even still around. So we had a very unique opportunity when the cap was taken off. All right, this is a little, sorry it's a little bit small here, but this is the public policy message. My president, Alan Epstein's a lawyer, and we have 2 lobbyists that work with us. And he goes and sees the governor's office, every BPU commissioner, every staff, the head of the Energy Committee on both the Senate and the Assembly, so that they understand our program in detail. And they get the fact that what we're all about is jobs. Long-term fixed 50% reduction in energy is going to keep jobs here. It's going to make the jobs and businesses in New Jersey more efficient. There are things called solar farms that people just take a farm and they put a solar project out there and they interconnect it. We're really against that. That's helping make a distribution network improve to go nowhere. It makes one person some money, and it does nothing for the jobs in New Jersey except use up SRACs in that supply and demand curve. And we've been very instrumental as a company in getting the governor and the BPU to push solar farms down. They're now capped at 10 megawatts, and they have a whole bunch of hurdles they have to go through to exist. because we believe they're just taking this economic stimulus package, this ratepayer money, and putting it in one guy's hands that is doing nothing for the state of New Jersey. And that message is very clear. On the other side, the governor uses us as a poster child. They bring us to companies thinking about leaving New Jersey and say, would you put your program in Del Monte before they leave the Elizabeth Port or Honeywell or companies like that, because of what we're able to do in the capital. I mentioned before too that we have $550 million of equity. That means it's Mike Ranger and I make a decision and we go. Right now we have no debt in the company, so it's an all equity company. So we can move, first mover advantage is huge. You know, there'll only be one 10 megawatt project at New York Life. There aren't going to be two of them. So you need to grab the market. No different than the telecom, no different than the power business. There was only one power plant at a paper mill. There weren't going to be two. So first mover advantage. So we tell the politicians, you got it right. We tell them to stick to your guns. And we tell them to continue to think about using SRACs only for jobs. Give homeowners rebates, take solar farms and kill them if you can, and focus SRACs, the subsidy from the rate base in New Jersey, on jobs in New Jersey. And we get good play with it. Okay.
Just to make it, the power cost, the energy cost for some of these companies is so large.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess just trying to make that point a little.
It's usually their second largest cost is electricity,
So
next to labor.
To make that decision
Yeah.
to stay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're talking about at 6 cents versus 12 cents, most of these people, you're dropping millions of dollars to their bottom line. And no escalation is huge for them. To be able, I'll tell you what New York Life said on Cokesbury. They went in front of the Clinton Township and said, you know, one, we've been here for 30 years. This will keep us here another 20. And more importantly to that, we've been deciding for another 100,000 square foot addition with a bunch of jobs, whether it be Alpharetta, Georgia, or Clinton, New Jersey. And with this, we'll put it here in Clinton. So 300, 400 more jobs on that one job are going to come back to New Jersey. So it's very powerful. Then you get the politicians locally saying, what can I do to make this happen? They start tripping over themselves to make this happen. New Jersey did a lot of other things public policy-wise to help. You know, New Jersey has a bad reputation, and it's earned justly, about permitting and about all of the problems of getting a project permitted in the state of New Jersey. Politicians recognize that. They listened. So they said, okay, solar projects, you'll need no variance or no permit for anything on the roof, height-wise, because one of the permits could be, oh, you're piercing the height of the roof. On ground-mounted systems, we're going to consider solar pervious, so you don't have lot coverage issues, which would be impervious. So if it's pervious, you can put it on top of grass and have no permit requirement, except for the local, you know, aesthetics or anything like that. Carports on top of are going to be perfectly allowed, and there'll be no height restrictions there. So they've set a whole set of rules up that they jam down the cities and towns' faces to say, you will do, on top of that, there was an omnibus that said you'll do nothing to hamper solar projects from happening quickly. Now, with all of that, it still takes 4 to 6 months to get a stupid permit in New Jersey, okay? Because you can only fight City Hall so long. Okay, so you got policies that have really been set up well. You've got a company that was right positioned with the infrastructure and the talent to go after it in a big way, bigger projects. Money came in, and now what have we done with it? So these are the projects we presently have under construction. Recognize we got our money last June, and it takes 5 or 6 months to get a permit, and we had a pretty tough winter. So there's, you know, not too bad to have these projects are under construction. White Rose down in Carteret. Let's see, this is North Jersey Media Group, which is the Bergen Record and USA Today newspaper. This is United Stationers, Williams-Sonoma. This is our corporate offices. We're also starting Tommy Hilfiger now, and Southgate Carports. So this one's under construction as well. And then we're doing Lawrenceville School. We're going to do Ramapo College. These are small. This is kind of, if you will, if you were to look at these, you say, okay, well, you know, say 3 to 6 megawatts, okay? Well, that was kind of stuff that was in the hopper when we first started moving. And again, you had a 2 megawatt cap, so then we moved kind of up to 3 to 6 megawatts. Okay, good sized projects, but we've moved from there. to where we're doing much larger projects, like 11 megawatts, which is 100 acres of solar to feed Vonage, the New York Life project. This will probably end up being a 10 megawatt project for ImClone and LifeCell. Mountain Creek, Crystal Springs, the whole, we're actually going to do 25 megawatts there. It's going to be about 200 acres. We're doing 20 megawatts for Merck, as I mentioned. We're buying 200 acres from them to put solar up. 200 acres. Now, when you guys go down 202 and you see the Johnson & Johnson facility, or you see some of those, if any of you driven by that facility where you see solar right by the road, that part out there is 1 megawatt. Okay, they have another megawatt in the back of carports. And they put it up just to check themselves and be green. Merck actually has a 1.5 megawatt project to be green. Back again, they did this in 08. When you start talking about 20 megawatts, you're talking about 30 million kilowatt hours a year. You're talking about a project that's going to cost well over $100 million to build. Pfizer, 10 megawatts. This is a resin company, Technoplex. AGFA. We're doing a landfill, which if the EPA approves it in May, we're taking a Chatham landfill in the Great Swamp, and we're putting 10 megawatts on the landfill as the PRPs, the companies that are responsible to clean the landfill and give us a land. And it's not a net metered project. So since it's not net metered, we weren't going to do the project until we came together with Drew University. And Drew has this huge sustainability mission. They're planting a forest to become, replant the forest that was in Madison decades ago and so on. We met with the president and their board. And we can wheel the power through JCP&L to Madison Electric to Drew. It gets there at about the same price as today's power. But it will make them 75, 80, 90% net zero off of a solar project, fix their power costs, off of a Superfund landfill in the middle of the Great Swamp. Really cool PR. So they are very much behind wanting us to do this, even though the net benefit economically is really nothing to them. It's all about sustainability, PR, and converting an eyesore in the Great Swamp into a solar project feeding Drew. So that's kind of a cool project. So this 120 megawatts is about $600 million of projects. And we have about another 100 megawatts in development. What do these projects look like, which I thought might be interesting for you? So this is an office building called Southgate up in Morristown. And there's Travelers, Marsh, and Covanta, 3 tenants here. All of this parking is going to have carports in it. So they're going to have the carport with the solar arrays on top, and it's going to feed about 55 to 60% of the power for the building. The project's in permitting. You can't see this too well. So this is Vonage down in Homedale. And they're there. This is a farm we purchased for 100 acres across the street that was going to have 17 McMansions on it. Real estate market's not too good. So we're putting solar here, going to make 10 megawatts, 11.5, sorry, and we're going to feed it across to Vonage. Interesting, again, remember the program in New Jersey. So Vonage rents their property from Mac Cali. They have a 7-year lease. They don't want to agree to renew. Of course, like they said, of course we will at 6-cent power here, but I don't want to be in the middle of all that. And my comment to them is, you have no termination, you have no minimum take, and if you go away in 7 years, go away. It won't make any economic difference to me. And at Mac Cali, you'll have a complex that'll still have, in this case, 15 or 20 million kilowatt hours at 6-cent power if you want it. I'm sure they're not going to go away, and if they did, I'm sure somebody else would jump in there with that advantage in their second largest cost. So pretty exciting project. And at the end of, what we did here with the person that owned this, is at the end of 20 years, we take the system off and they have their property back and they can go build their houses 20 years from now. So the Seeing Eye is a company up in Morristown that does all the dogs. It's a really cool thing, and we're going to put a couple of megawatts right here and feed them. So again, what you see is we started to go to ground-mounted systems. Roofs are complicated. We're doing a lot of roofs, but they become more complicated. This is New York Life in Cokesbury. This is Cokesbury Road. We're putting megawatts all around here. We're going to do a little bit of their roof, and we're actually renting a farmer right behind a school. We're renting about another 10 acres of farmland so that we can fit their load in. Yep?
When you say ground mounts, I mean, does that land come
For the 15 or 20 years that we're there, yeah, we either drive columns down and put the panels up, or we put ballast and just leave it sit there. At the end of 20 years, we pull the columns up if we want, or take it away, or sell it back for them for, we've lost, the S-RACs are over. Maybe there'll be a REC trading, renewable energy credit trading through the world, but at this point, we'll take it and restore the ground and give it back to you.
What's the life of the panels?
25 to 30. Obviously, no one's really proven that, but yeah, the warranties will go out. You can buy warranties out to 30 years. It degrades over time. I think it's a half point a year, but you can buy that. We also put a very complicated, something called Novita system on, so we actually can watch the production of every panel, every array, all of the different combiner boxes and inverters and how they're working and so on and so forth, so that we can maintain them. You go there twice a year and you wash them down. So, look, it's not something that's going to move our total country's energy needle, but it is something that can make a significant difference. The more we distribute the power down, no one asked the question of why didn't the utility build all these? If it's fines against their shareholders, why weren't they out there building it rather than paying $40, $50 million in fines? Good question. Okay, the reason is the BPU and the state said, no, 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 no. If we let the utility come in and build this, it's not going to be distributed to all the businesses and buildings in New Jersey. They're going to build it one spot for their only need, their only desire is to avoid the fine. So you might as well just let them build a utility power plant, because that's not going to help New Jersey. So they limited them. For the guys that drive around New Jersey, you see those little solar things on the poles. They have like one panel there. They limited them to a total of like 80 or 100 megawatts total between all the utilities. And you can build them in certain conditions for certain reasons, and everything else has to be built by others, distributed throughout the state. So I'll just show you a few more projects. This is a cool project on 206. This is ImClone is right here, and LifeCell is right here, and we bought all this land, and we're putting there's a stream in here. We'll have some wetland issues, but we're putting projects here to feed one or both of them. We're still in discussions as to who gets the power there. They're kind of like first to the table will get the power. So you see, very different than the concept. It's like the concept was we'll put solar on a roof and we'll do net metering. And when they've now let somebody like myself really come in and say, okay, now I can buy a piece of, this is 65 acres. I can buy 65 acres, put solar on and sell 10 megawatts to a user on a net metered basis. Now I'm really making an impact to keep someone like ImClone in New Jersey. So it all works together, and that's really what I wanted to show you. We're doing some quarries, 3 quarries that came to us, and then this is just some of the others that we mentioned already. Sizes is what I wanted to kind of give you a sense of. From 100 kilowatts at a house, where there's thousands and thousands and they don't add up to anything, to where you start doing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of projects that make 100% of these companies' electric load because of the net metering and because of the rules that are allowed. Public policy really working, and in Merck's case, helped keep them here in New Jersey instead of leaving, which was what they were going to do only a few months ago.
Does the firm, in terms of what you actually deliver, I mean, are you designing it, and then are you doing the actual construction, or do you have a contractor?
Yeah, we have 8 contractors right now working for us, and a host of engineering firms and so on that do the design, detailed designs. We have 12 out of the 20 people are engineers in the company, but we do not design the work. We will manage and oversee it. We give a turnkey contract to a company. We might buy the panels. Like I mentioned, the Chinese were here offering us $750 million worth of 15-year 5% debt if we buy their panels, which is what we did on the switches with Lucent, or the turbines with GE, or the turbines with Siemens. So it's vendor financing, finding a win-win. We're going to cut that deal with them, and they're just going to bring our dollars back to this country. But in a way, they're helping keep jobs in New Jersey from my point of view, because they have the best panels at the best prices. So, and they want to do turnkey installations, working with U.S. companies to do that. We tend to have a turnkey EPC. Maybe we bought the equipment, but most of the time it's turnkey to us. And then they may give us operation and maintenance for a certain period of time. We have a VP of operations, and we'll operate the systems over time. But We are the owner and the operator. We're not the builder. We are integral in the design and development. Setbacks and other things are critical to how many megawatts you can put on the land, so we get involved in that kind of stuff, and all the local permits. Yeah.
So if you're a private entrepreneur and you want to make just a regular solar farm without having it connected to a specific building, you're not allowed to do that?
No, you are.
But there's limits, is that what you're saying?
Yes, you're limited to 10 megawatts. You have certain other hurdles you have to go through because you're actually selling it back to PJM. You're actually selling it back to the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland grid. You're not selling it to the utility company. So you have to go through a PJM application that takes about 18 months. And then you have to go through an interconnect study with the utility company to figure out where your substation is going to connect to their system. You know, for any of you that read that white paper I sent out, I do want to talk about that, but the distribution network is a really important aspect of stuff. The study that they do says July 4th, it's bright, sunny, your system is now pumping out all it can pump out, and for some reason everyone's closed, there's no use anywhere in the network. That power has to go back through their meter and the system has to stay stable, okay? And that's the interconnect upgrade that we have to pay for. Whatever it requires to meet that condition, breakers, capacitors, substations, increased voltage, whatever, we pay for the increase of that, which is the improvement of the distribution network in that region. So it could be a couple $1 million that we have to pay the utility company to do this interconnect upgrade. And that gives us the right. In a solar farm, you have to do that as well, okay? So you're paying that, but then you have another step of the PJM grid. So the white paper that was sent out, we were in New Jersey are subsidizing the solar business by a 1 or 2% ultimate tax on your bill. And shame on you, you're making something happen that shouldn't happen. So the white paper that the Gable Associates did was very important to answer those questions. And it's not intuitive to, well, sure, we're paying more, it has to be therefore costing us more. And the answer is no, it actually isn't. And it starts off with the easy stuff. Well, you're creating a whole lot of construction jobs and you're creating a whole lot of taxes from that. Short term, the incremental tax is 15 years, right? If it gets to that point. Secondly, our message that we talked about today. We're maintaining jobs. The first 100 megawatts, I think, maintain something like 50,000 jobs in New Jersey. Talk about the taxes, the homes, the businesses, and so on of keeping that many jobs in New Jersey. That's a big deal, and that can put a number to it. Then you talk about the distribution network, because all these solar projects are paying for the increase of the distribution network. Therefore, the ratepayers don't have to pay for the increase of the distribution network, which is happening because you're taking more power at each of your homes. So instead of having a 12 kV unit, you now need a 34 kV unit to your development because everyone's home is using more. Who pays for that? Well, the rate base does, which means you do. But if we pay for it, it saves the rate base from having to pay for it. And then the last thing, which is a little more complicated, but public policy is interesting. The way the power is purchased in New Jersey, it's called order merit pay. So you stack up the needs for that day. Let's say it's 50,000 kilowatt hours is needed in that day. And everyone bids, day, week, month. They all bid. And when they hit the need, the person at the highest price is what everyone receives. Okay? So that you can bid low, 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 but eventually someone's going to be at 5 cents, and that's what everyone's going to receive for that day's kilowatts. Solar is on the bottom. So when is solar produced? Well, it's produced on peak and in the middle of summer when the utility's out there buying 60-cent power because it's on peak and they're having everyone shed that can shed. So we're producing power at the best time possible for them. And by having that stack, the whole stack goes up. That means the whole price they pay to everyone else goes down because they take and they can accept a lower bid and pay everyone that bid. When you do that analysis, which is a complicated BPU analysis, you find that solar actually is hugely beneficial cost-wise to New Jersey. Unlike wind. And how many of you either heard of or watched Boone Pickens with his 600 megawatt wind farm out there in Oklahoma? Okay, he was putting $10 billion of wind out there. Anyone know what happened to it other than it died? Okay, he pulled his money and said, I'm done and I can't get it done. And people were like, that's our country, we're just against wind. Okay, that's far from the truth. What he did is he tried to take that power and he took it to every state. I'll run a transmission line, or you run a transmission line, and I'll connect to Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, every state possible, and every state turned him down. Do you think they turned him down because they didn't like him? No. They turned him down because 600 megawatts of wind at that particular location, most of the time, is generating at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning. States don't want 600 megawatts at 3 in the morning. That is a disaster for their base-loaded plants, whether they be coal, nuclear, or oil. On top of which, you can't even guarantee me you're bringing it to me every day or every night. You're going to bring it to me whenever it comes, and I don't have any load for it. So that was the problem with wind, is that it's usually in the evenings. It's when you have a dusk, when the load is dropped, and it's unpredictable at a bad time. So when you talk about wind and the big fight about it being in the ocean and all of that, there are issues with wind that are really electrically driven, that are public policy to be resolved. So,
Mary McCann.
I just wanted to say on behalf of our class of policy studies, I just wanted to thank you for
Oh,
taking the time to come out here.
you're welcome, thank you.